All right, ladies, this week you're going to read about several different kind of parts of church history. So, the first chapter you're going to read is about kind of the growing conflict between the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Empire, which at the time was one big church, but we're really talking about the church in the East and the West, okay? So, the Roman Empire was very large, and of course, that meant it was difficult to communicate with all those people and to have a consistent way of thinking across the board. And so we see kind of this growing conflict, and it centers around several things, but topics that were brought up in the first seven councils of the church. So one of the issues dealt with the Holy Spirit. The Byzantine church, or the eastern part of the empire, didn't really agree with the wording that we were using about the Holy Spirit. They also didn't really agree with the treatment of Mary and the saints as being people that we kind of prayed intercessory prayers to, asking them to kind of go to God with our prayers. Another huge thing dealt with icons. Icons were religious art. And in the eastern part of the church, they started to see religious art as being idolatrous and something that distracted you from God. Whereas in the western part of the church, they saw it as something that kind of mediated your relationship with God or helped you feel a sense of God. And keep in mind that a lot of the early a lot of the early art was there because people were illiterate and they couldn't read and write. And so those pieces of art kind of told the story. And so for a lot of people, the art really served an important purpose. But it became kind of distracting. And so in the eastern part of the church, they didn't really believe that any art was acceptable that was overly realistic or had a lot of detail to it. So they kind of, if they did have art, they believed in very simple art. And so there were even some emperors that made them go through the churches and destroy artwork because, again, they thought it was idolatrous. There were differences in the way that we celebrated the Mass. In the West, we spoke the language of Latin, and in the East, everything was in Greek. And there was just some differences in the practice of the Mass. So, for example, while the Eucharist was being celebrated in the East, that often happened behind a curtain, and there was a lot of mystery surrounding what happened, where in the West, that happened kind of where people could visibly see what was happening. A big issue also was the Pope. The Pope was seen as the most important person, and in the West, they saw the Pope as the highest authority on earth. In the East, they had a person who was called the Patriarch of Constantinople. And in the East, they wanted the Patriarch and the Pope to be seen as equal. And in the West, they saw the Pope as above the Patriarch. And so that led to a lot of problems. And so eventually we see these coming to a head in like 1015 AD, around there, where there was a split between the Eastern and the Western Church. This is known as the Great Schism. Schism is a word that means split. And from then on, the East was known as the Orthodox Church, which Orthodox means right, or, the true church. And the other half of the church, the western part of the church, was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church also saw themselves as the right church, or the truth. The next chapter you're going to read is about the rise of Islam. And so this happened in the 500s. Muhammad was the person who was the first prophet of Islam, if you will. And Muhammad was a caravan driver in Mecca, and he would go into this cave and kind of meditate and spend time alone. And while he was in the cave, he had all these visions from the angel Gabriel, or in Islam, they might call him the angel Jibril. And Jibril told him all of these revelations from God, which Muhammad couldn't read and write, so Muhammad then would translate all of that and kind of memorize everything that Jibril told him. And so everything that he memorized and then told to other people was eventually written down and put into the Quran. The Quran is the sacred piece of writing for the Islamic people. And in Islam, they recognize Jesus, but they think Jesus was a prophet and that he was fully human. And although they see him as like the most important human, and so they do have some special kind of devotions to Jesus too. Also in the Quran, if you were to read it, you would read some of the biblical stories that we know and love too. But as Islam spread, they took over much of the far eastern part of what was originally the Roman Empire. And so they kind of blocked access to the Holy Land for Christian people. And they wouldn't allow eventually Christian people to travel into the Holy Land. And that's when the Crusades happened. So Pope Urban II was the Pope at the time, and in conjunction with the Byzantine Emperor, convinced the people, the Catholic Christian people, that in order to have access to the Holy Land, we needed to enter into what's called the Crusades. And he really appealed to some very common folk and some people who were very poor. And those crusaders really felt like they had this important cause to fight for. So they started the Crusades, and the first Crusade had a good cause, again, to take back the Holy Land. And the Crusaders were victorious in the first Crusade. But every crusade after that was a big defeat, basically. And eventually, by the third and fourth Crusade, the focus moved from being about taking over the Holy Land to more about trying to get wealth and kind of looting churches and taking over land and destroying Islamic houses of worship. And there wasn't any other crusade where Christians were victorious. Every one of them, in the end, they lost. And so the only really thing that was gained from the Crusades was kind of an understanding of Islam and an exposure to some other cultural, Eastern practices. Otherwise, the Crusades were a big failure. And again, it became about wealth and power more than it became about this religious pilgrimage. Islam, though, became a religion that was a real obstacle for Christianity at various moments. Islam has what they call the 5 pillars. And so their main beliefs are that they need to make this profession of faith, that they need to pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. They believe in fasting during the month of Ramadan. And fasting for them means that they don't eat anything after sunrise until sunset. And they also believe in almsgiving. They have to give a certain percentage of their wealth back to the church. And then they believe in the Hajj, which is a religious pilgrimage that every Islamic person is supposed to make at some point in their life, if they can afford it. Another kind of element of Islam is what they call jihad. And jihad in its origin was just about spreading the faith, but eventually became translated at times into using violent means to spread the faith. And so sometimes in modern times we hear of Islamic people, and these are real extremists, not the normal Islamic person, but justifying some violent actions as a jihad or a way to spread the faith. In chapter 13, you're going to read about the rise of monasticism. And this is kind of this attempt to go off alone and try to spend time focusing on prayer and worship. And I think it makes sense that monasticism really spread fast in this time period when there was so much upheaval within the church with the Crusades and with the split with the Byzantine church. And so these people spent a lot of time in study and worship. And we see in this era kind of this rise of all these different monastic groups, okay? And they were really known as religious orders. So in the homework this week, you're going to study these religious orders. You just need to research one of them. And these are all Christian groups, okay? So some examples might be the Benedictines, the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Cappadocians, the Cistercians, or the Dominicans, okay? So look into one of those orders and research how they started and who their founder was and what their founding beliefs were. The backdrop to this time period also is the feudal system. So in outside of the monasteries, they're seeing this rise in everyone having kind of a place and knowing their place and living in that place and respecting kind of the order of society. Before I end the video, I just want to remind you that the paper outline is actually due March 3rd. I said the wrong date in my video last week, but I did send an email to clarify that. And then also you're going to take a midterm exam on March 10th, and I'll talk more about the midterm next week. Have a great week.